session I'll be recording the sessions, right? And I'll be uploading them to Google Drives, right? So that when you
Okay.
are when you are looking to refer to the sessions and all, you can do it directly, right?
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Right.
uh, Great. Fine. So uh, just to start off with, right? So talking about credit risk. So this is something about which you will have definitely have some idea. And my objective over here would be to dig deeper into the idea and to form and to give you a better perspective of the subject from different aspects, from different technical aspects, from different credit aspects, and so on. So over here, talking about credit risk, right? So what we do, like what we want to do over here is, so we first break this word down into two parts. So this word can be broken down into two halves. One is credit, and the other is risk. So credit risk is nothing but credit plus risk. This is credit. And the second that I have over here is it's risk, right? Now, first of all, what is this credit? The credit is the loans which are extended by banks to the people. So it's basically loans or credit products. Loans or the credit products. So basically, what the bank does is the bank lends these product credits or different credit products to people who ask for it. So mostly the people who ask for it or the obligor can be both a commercial entity or it may be a retail or a household entity. So basically credit is nothing but loans or credit products which are given out to the borrower. And the next part is risk. So the question that comes out over here is that what is risk? The first thing that we need to do before even we set out talking about credit risk and all, the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand what exactly is risk. Now, risk is something, or risk is an event which creates a stochasticity in the cash flow, right? Now, what does stochasticity mean? Stochasticity is just a fancy word, it's a technical term for a probability, so which makes the cash flows of the organization very probabilistic in nature, right? So it brings in risk, creates stochasticity in cash flows, creates stochasticity in cash flows. Now, this concept of stochasticity will be something which will be really very important, right? It will be really important when we start, or when we start talking about credit risk. So this stochasticity in cash flows, and the objective of the entire risk management is to reduce or minimize this stochasticity or this uncertainty in the cash flows. Stochasticity in cash flows. Cash flows. Hi Harpreet, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry, it just got
No,
disconnected.
not a problem. I'll just dismiss the first one.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you. So, Harpreet, you can be on mute. Okay, and whatever questions you have, you can unmute yourself or you can put your question in the chat box, whatever works. Okay. So as
Okay.
yeah. So as I was saying, that risk is something which creates stochasticity in the cash flows. So the next question that comes up over here is that what is stochasticity? Stochasticity is nothing but element of probability, or you know it refers to a outcome, or it refers to a setup where there are multiple outcomes and each of the outcomes have some probability associated with them. So the cash flow is not a sure event. So there is a distribution associated with the cash flows. So for example, let's uh, let's think about this very simple thing, right? So suppose a bank has rupees 100 and the bank has lent out that rupees 100. Now, when the bank gets the rupees 100 back, they'll get, say, 12 rupees as interest at the end of the year. So when the bank gets back that entire amount plus the interest, the profit of the bank becomes 100 plus 12, that is 112 is the total revenue, and the profit is 12. But if the person takes the money and doesn't give back the money at all, then the bank loses out 100 bucks. So with the for the bank, minus 100 can occur with some probability, and 12 plus 12 can occur with a probable with some probability. Right now, in case the person who takes the loan does not return back anything, then what happens is that the person may lose out. I mean, that the bank lose out all the 100 rupees, right? And that will have some probability. And in case the person gives back the entire amount, the bank gets 112 rupees back, and his profit turns out to be rupees 12. Therefore, that is the probable. So that is again another probability of the bank. So these are the two possibilities, right? And both of these two are directly impact the cash flows of the bank. Now, every bank has an average cash flow, right? On quarter basis, month on month basis, year on year basis. But these events like lending, risk, and all, risk affects creates fluctuation about the average cash flow, right? So that is the reason why there can be multiple possibilities, and each of the possibilities will have certain chances of occurrence, and that is why we say that risk creates stochasticity, or talking about it in a very simple term, uncertainty in the cash flows. It creates uncertainties in the cash flows. Uncertainty in the cash flow, right? So there is credit risk. So basically, this is what is risk, and the objective of the entire risk management exercise is to minimize the element of this uncertainty. Right. So the objective of risk management is to minimize uncertainty, and to minimize this uncertainty, we develop all these statistical models, all scorecards, all regulatory models, and everything. And the entire superstructure is targeted at minimizing this uncertainty and stabilizing the cash flows of the organization, cash flow of the bank. Now, the question that comes out over here is that if there is a risk involved in the lending process, then why would a bank lend it at all? Why would I, as a bank, go ahead and lend the funds if I know that there would not be any such? I mean, if I know that there is some risk in not lending, I mean, in lending out the funds. Now, to do this, we need to assess, we need to understand the functions that a bank plays in an economy, right? Now, so we are aware of it at a theoretical level, though, but over here I would be talking about it from a more, you know, from a more business perspective, right? So basically, say for as a bank, so bank is a institution, right? It's a financial institution, and one major role of banks is to channelize funds across the nation. So across the economy, its objective is to channelize funds. Now, how does it channelize the funds? Now, every economy has two sides: a demand for funds, and on the other side, what we have is the supply of funds. The demand for funds are those, it is that demand, and that demand is created by the entrepreneurs, the business side, the commercial portfolio, as well as the households. On the other hand, the households themselves are the suppliers of these funds. So basically, what happens is the households keep their money in the bank, right? And the commercial portfolios and the commercial borrowers, the entrepreneurs, the business people, they come and they they come to the bank for requirement of funds. So basically, the entrepreneurs, they require business, they require funds to start their own business. On the other hand, they start. On the other hand, the households who have funds, they are the ones who give, they have the funds which they want to keep in the bank, right? So that their money can, multiply. So their money can, uh, money can increase in the form of interest, and they can earn a recurring interest income, be it on a quarterly basis or on an income basis. So the objective of a bank is to channelize all these funds accordingly. So therefore, the role of the bank, now this is where the bank plays its role. Now the bank acts as an intermediary between the demand for funds and the suppliers of funds. And in between it makes some profits of its own. But while it does it, there has to be some responsible behavior shown by the bank, because at the end of the day, the bank is lending out someone else's money to someone else. And it might happen that the person who had deposited the money might come down to the bank and ask for that money. They come and ask for that loan. I mean, come and ask for the deposit. So the bank must always be in a position to provide back the money to that person. So that is the reason why, or that is the objective with which this entire thing actually operates. So, and from a business perspective, now if I think about the story entirely from the bank's perspective, now what the bank simply does is the bank borrows the funds from a low risk segment, and it provides the funds to a high risk segment, and in between it earns an interest differential as its profits, right? So basically, the household segment is the low risk segment who are coming and depositing the money with the bank. Now, what the bank does is the bank takes that money and lends to a borrower, to a entrepreneur, or to another household member who has some requirement of credit. Now, this is a more risky segment, and hence what the bank does is the bank charges a higher rate of interest from this segment. Say for example, I deposit my money and the bank gives me 4% per annum, right? 4% rate of interest yearly. And using my money, it is lending out to some Mr. Malaya or to some Mr. Modi, uh, at 12% or 15%, right? So the interest differential, that 4% minus 15% minus 4%, that 11% is the profit which uh, the bank makes out of whatever we had. So that is where this benefit, or that is where the profit comes in. Now, credit extended out by banks, right? They are a source of profit for the bank. They are a source of profit for the bank. So how does the bank earn that profit? The bank earns that profit by or from the interest differential, by arbitraging the funds from a low risk segment to a high risk segment. So the source of profit is nothing but the interest differential. There is an interest differential, right? Now, when there is an interest differential, and this interest differential happens when you are arbitraging it from low risk segment to a high risk segment. Now, there are multiple possibilities, and the risk. So there are multiple possibilities, right? So one very simple possibility is that I, as a depositor, keep my money with the bank. There is an entrepreneur who demands money from the bank. So the bank takes my money from here and gives it to the entrepreneur. Now, since I'm borrowing the money to the bank and lending the money to the bank charges gives me a 4% rate of interest, and it is giving it to the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is a diligent entrepreneur, and he takes the money, he does his business, and at the end of the year, he pays back the 100 rupees with some 10% rate of interest. And in between the transaction, 10% minus 4%, 6% is the profit of the bank. So bank keeps back the
Hello.
6%. Yeah, hello.
Your voice broke for 2 minutes, with 10 seconds, and then it came back.
Okay, okay, okay. Can you hear me now? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So the bank keeps that 6% and pays back the 4%. So that's a win-win situation for all. Now, the fact that this scenario
Mm-hmm.
will sustain is dependent on the characteristic of the borrower who is taking the money from the bank. Now, the risk in or this credit risk arises from the behavior of the borrower, or due to the existence of certain you know private information on part of the borrower who is taking the funds. So when the bank is giving me the money, the bank does not actually know whether I am a good borrower or a bad borrower. So do I intend to pay back that money, or do I not intend to pay back that money? Right? Therefore, what needs to happen is we need to assess the borrower. Because if I give out the money to the wrong person, then he may not give back the money to me. And when the next day, when the depositors come to ask me for the money, I may not be able to give the money to them, and hence I might go into a liquidation, resulting in a reputation risk. So one risk, so the risk from lending might, manifest itself to other forms of risk, such as reputation risk, liquidity risk, etc. Right? So this risk arises from the presence of certain private information with the borrower, which is not accessible to the, to the banker. Now, in such a scenario, lending becomes really risky, and in order to reduce that, in order to reduce the or to minimize the extent of the risk, right, what we have is the risk management strategies. And one such risk management strategy, or one of the many risk management strategies, is credit risk models. Right? So, using credit risk models, what we are trying to do is we are trying to form an understanding of who the borrower is, how good or how bad the borrower possibly can be. Once he's given the loan, it helps us understand whether a borrower goes into a default or not. So therefore, that is where this risk management strategies come and play its role, right? And credit risk models are one of the most extensively used methods by banks to manage risk, because these groups of statistical models help us frame an idea about the borrower on the other side, and it also helps us capture certain trends in his behavior which he may not personally reveal, right? So that is where the role of credit risk models come in. Now, to understand the role that a credit risk model might play in the risk management strategy of a bank, what we need to do is we need to understand the very traditional banking approaches. So, for example, if I go back to the 1930s, right, the old days, now what happened over there was interest rate was used as a technique to control the demand for credit. So basically, the idea was that if I charge a higher rate of interest on the loan, the demand for credit would go down, and I would be able to manage risk in that manner. Because if the overall, if the overall demand for credit goes down, then the overall exposure of the bank to risk also go down, right? Because interest is the cost of borrowing, and higher the rate of interest, lower will be the demand for funds. So that was the original strategy which banks used to take in the 1930s. But there was a possible challenge to this which they did not think of. While this strategy reduced the overall quantity of the credit, it also resulted in degrading the overall quality of the credit. So the overall quality of the credit degraded. Why so? Because when you have raised up the rate of interest, right? Now the diligent borrowers who are the good borrowers, they feel that at this high rate of interest, if I take up the loan, that will lead to a huge cost. And I may not be able to repay back the cost after adjusting for my profits, and I might go become a defaulter. So what he does is he moves out of the lending cycle. So obviously his demand goes up. On the other hand, there is this unscrupulous borrower, there is this bad borrower who does not care about defaulting. So he is like, I'll take the money from the bank, I'll do my business, and then I'll not return back the money, right? So we obviously had Nirav Modis and Malayas during those days as well. So what happens over there is this bad guy goes and takes up the loan, and more people like this goes and takes up the loan. So at the end of the day, it was seen that the overall distribution of the borrowers were more skewed towards the bad borrowers, and huge number of defaults happened. So it was understood that, controlling the total quantity of the credit was not only sufficient. I mean, that was not only sufficient, but also you had to control for the quality of the credit, right? You needed to frame an idea about the behavior of the borrower who is coming up, right? And you need to assess that it's not about the total quantity of the credit, but it is about channelizing the credit to specific branches, to specific channels. So how do I specify, how do I move my credit throughout, right? So that is something which is really very important for us, right? So and that is where this entire concept comes in. This entire concept of risk management or predictive modeling comes in. So it becomes very necessary to identify the borrower who is coming to take up the loan. And it is this place where risk management strategies come in, right? So the next thing that we need to understand from here is that the risk management strategies will not help us, would help us not only in regulating the overall quantity of the credit, but it will also help us channelize the credit to good quality borrowers, right? So say suppose there are three people, A, B, and C, who comes in to me asking for a credit. I need to know that if I give the loan to any one of them, I would be exposed to some risks. But out of these three, who is the one to whom, if I give the credit, I would have the maximum chances of getting back my credit? So that is precisely what the idea is, right? So over here, what we want to do is that, so the objective of risk management strategies going forward, as we would see, is that it is not only to control the overall credit, but to channelize the credit in respective into the best possible channel. So credit allocation is one of the major objectives that the risk management strategy would have, right? So this is the basic idea. And when we are studying credit risk modeling, we are trying to develop risk management ideas, or we are trying to manage the risk at different stages of a customer's credit life cycle, right? So I'll just take a quick pause over here and I'll take up any questions if you have. Though this was very basic in nature, but still you might have some questions. Harpreet, are you there? Hello?
Hello.
Hey, hi Harpreet. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so what happened was you had chosen some mobile audio. So there are two audio options. One is, so when
Okay.
you join in, there are two audio options. One is the system audio, that is which connects you to the laptop audio, and the other is for your mobile
Mhm.
audio. So if you are joining in from
And if I
mobile
wish to,
only, if you if you are joining in from your
no, no.
mobile, then you press
Mhm.
that mobile audio. Otherwise, there would be a problem.
Okay. And if I wish to chat, I just need to click on this, right?
Yeah, on the
How
chat
do
box.
I
On the chat box.
try it once?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because you had gone through that, when you had assigned the mobile audio, the entire system was
Mhm.
looking out for some chat from a mobile or some from that app. When it was not coming, your chat box
Okay.
was not working.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so this is the
Yes.
first time, so there might be some problems. Not an issue.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So I just put you on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. So as I was saying about, so basically, what I was saying during that time was, I was talking about the risk management. So the credit risk models, these modeling techniques. So these modeling techniques are a part of the customer's credit life, or managing risks at different part of the customer's credit life cycle, right? So So basically, if we are talking about credit risk management, or credit risk and managing credit risk and the role of credit risk models. So credit risk models turn out to be an efficient way of managing risk, managing the credit risk at different parts of the customer's credit life cycle. Right. To understand the role of these models, the first thing that we need to understand is that what is a customer's credit life cycle, or let's call it the customer's credit cycle. The customer's credit cycle. So the first thing that happens in a customer's credit cycle is that there is a customer who comes in asking for a loan. So the applicant asks for a loan. Asks asks for a credit. Now, when the customer asks for a credit, the first question that we need to understand, or from a banking perspective that we need to answer, is that why would a customer, so basically, that if a customer asks for a credit, the first thing that we ask ourselves is that should we give the loan to the borrower or to the applicant or not? So, the first question that we try to assess over here is a yes or a no. So there is a no or a yes, right? Now, after this, the next part is that once he has given the loan, right? So, applicant asks for credit. Yes. Now, if he is given the loan, the next, if he is not given the loan, the cycle terminates right there. Now, if he is given the loan, the next question that comes out to us is that how willing, or rather, is he willing to pay back the loan? That is, this is a part of the account management strategies, right? So basically, what I've done is I've given him the loan now, and he's paying back his EMIs. And as a borrower, what I need to do is I need to do his account management, right? So, for example, if I see that he is not paying back his, or he's missed out his installments or something, then it is my responsibility to follow up with him to understand why he has missed it out, and then what is he planning to do, and so on, right? So the next question that happens over here is that is he willing to pay back the loan, he willing to pay back. So basically, if he is willing to pay back the loan, or if he is paying back his loan diligently, then I need not really bother about it, right? So is he willing to pay back? So over there, the next question again over here is yes or no. So if it is yes, then that's again okay, right? And I know that there is nothing much to do with this particular guy. So he is actually paying back his loan, and he's a good borrower, he's a diligent guy, and I'm okay with it. However, if he is not paying back the loan, no. Then the next question that comes out over here is that how likely is he to default in the next 12 months? How likely is he to default? Or is he likely to default? So the first question over here, the first thing is I ask, so my applicant is coming out asking for a credit. The next part that I want to answer is he willing to pay back the loan? If yes, that's okay. If no, I want to know is he likely to default? If he is likely to default, if he is likely to default, no, then that's okay. And then if he is, however, if he is likely to default, or there are chances of this borrower to default, then what happens is the next part, that should collections be initiated? Should collections be initiated? should collections be initiated? So again, there's a yes or a no to it, right? So basically, obviously, if he is dealing, if he is becoming, if he has defaulted or he is very close to default, then obviously collections be initiated, yes, and then finally the account is written off or charged off. However, if it is no, then the customer is then that's okay. He's still working, operating on the book. He might have gone delinquent, but he's still trying to pay back and cure back, and this kind of an activity always goes on, right? So this is what we are trying to do over here. So basically, an applicant asks for credit. So the question that comes out is, he willing to pay back? The next question that comes out is that how likely is he or she to default? The next question is, yes, should collections be initiated or not, right? So that is the entire flow that we have over here. Clear? Harpreet, up to this point, is it clear to you?
Yes,
Okay,
it is clear to me.
great. Now, the next part and the most important part is the questions that we pose, or the business or the problem that we pose at each stage will be or is addressed by credit risk models, right? So one question that we pose over here is, at this first stage, that why does so the applicant asks for a credit. So what are the business questions that the bank will pose? The first question that the bank poses is that, is he a good borrower? Is he a potential good borrower? Is he a potential good borrower? Rather, is he or she a potential good borrower? Now, to address this, the model or the approach that the bank will take is y equals to 1. So the problem the bank faces the following problem: y equals to 1 if the borrower is a good borrower. If the borrower is good, is equal to 0 otherwise. I'll come to that. I'll come to that. So basically, the y is a variable, right? So what I'm saying is that so y is my dependent or my target variable, so to say, right? So generally in the statistical paradigm, right? So all independent variables are always talked about as x, and all dependent variables are talked about as y. So this y is equal to 1 if the borrower is good, is equal to 0 otherwise. So if the so the dependent variable or the target or the outcome variable of the model, right? So if an applicant asks for credit, right? So what is the final outcome of the model? So if I'm developing a model, what is the final outcome? So it is either y is equal to 1 or y is equal to 0. So that is the final outcome that you can have, right? So y equal to 1 if the borrower is good, equal to 0 otherwise. So over here, at the first stage, the first question which the bank is trying to assess is whether the borrower is good or bad. Now, there is a lot of personal or there are a lot of private information involved, right? So I might look appear to be a very diligent borrower. I might appear to be, say, Vijay Malia, right? So I'm a very rich borrower. I'm a very rich person and I look very diligent, but that does not necessarily ensure that I'll not run away with your money. So basically, for the bank, what happens is the bank needs to assess whether a particular borrower is good or bad. So that's the first question that they come up with. And unfortunately, they cannot give us always a 1-0 answer. So what the bank will be doing is, or the objective or the purpose of the bank over here is to develop a model and from that model form an estimate of the probability of y equals to 1. So if a borrower comes in, right, and asks for asks for a fund, the model or the bank must have the capacity to look into the required information of the borrower and find out and estimate the chances of this borrower of being a bad, or I mean of being a good borrower, or a being a bad borrower, whatever we call, right? So this is what, so this is a basic problem that we address at this application stage. So when an applicant comes in and asks for a credit product, the first question the bank tries to answer is that whether is this borrower a potentially good borrower or a potentially bad borrower. Now, if the borrower is good, so basically there are two outcomes: y equal to 1 if the borrower is good, is equal to 0 otherwise. So this is precisely what the bank tries to answer. And what is it that they are trying to assess at this stage? So at this stage, what the bank is trying to assess is that, so they ask two questions. First is he a reliable borrower? Is he a reliable borrower? Is he a reliable borrower? That is one. The next question that comes out is that, can he afford the product? Okay. So yes, Harpreet, over here when I talk about product, I'm talking about the credit product, right? So basically, a credit product can be a credit card, it can be a personal loan, it can be an automobile loan, it can be, a kind of uh, this thing. So basically, it can be a mortgage product, anything. So the first question that I want to assess over here is that, is he a potential good borrower? So when I'm assessing a potential good borrower, the question that I ask at this stage is that, is he a reliable borrower and can he afford the product? Now, when I know that okay, these are the two things that is there, that is where I move on to the next part. So over here, so this stage of the customer's credit life cycle or the customer's credit cycle, this stage is called the origination stage or the acquisition stage. So this stage is called the origination stage or the acquisition stage. Right? So at this stage, what the per bank does is they assess, or what a bank looks for is the assess, or the matrices looked over here are like reliability matrices. So how reliable is the borrower, right? And the affordability matrices. So these are a few important things. Also, these are the few important matrices which we look into at the origination stage of the of the customer's credit cycle. This is the reliability stage.
Okay. So, so you will be telling about these matrices,
Yeah, yeah.
I think later.
I'll just give you an overview now, and then we'll talk about details when we go on to the acquisition scorecards and all. So basically, when I talk about reliability matrices, so how do I identify whether a borrower is reliable or not? So to understand whether a borrower is reliable or not, I need to assess mostly his demographic information. So, for
Okay.
example, let's take that there is a very rich businessman who has millions of dollars and asks for a credit card from my bank, ABC, whatever it is.
Mm.
But what I see is that this gentleman is a chemical plant owner in the region of Syria, right? Now,
Okay.
by the knowledge, by by from a knowledge about the region, we know that Syria is a area which is like infested with terrorism and such illegal activities. That is where the doubt comes in, and for most of the banks, for most banks, the Syria is a Syria is a sanctioned, it's a country of sanctioned list, sanctioned country, right? So there is a list of sanctions, and come in countries which fall within those sanction lists are they are red flag country. You do not give it because there are certain reliability issues with the borrower. On the other hand, affordability matrices will talk about the capability of the borrower to take up loans for that, right? So these are the
Okay.
two matrices that we look into while giving out a loan to or giving out a credit product to a borrower, right? So in we'll detail upon the reliability matrices and the affordability matrices when we go into the origination or development of the origination of the acquisition scorecard, right? So over here, we
Okay.
are just creating the overall framework. So what you see is that the
Mm-hmm.
objective for the bank over here is to estimate the probability that the borrower would be a good borrower, equal to, or he would be a bad borrower. Now, based on certain risk upon, we need to identify the key risk drivers which can help us assess the reliability and the affordability of the borrower for the product, right? So this is what the overall picture at the origination or the acquisition stage is, and this
Okay.
is delivered, or this entire thing is, I mean, acquisition scorecards or origination scorecards help us assess these factors. So they help us assess
Okay.
whether a borrower is a good borrower or a bad borrower. And based on the probability of the borrower of being a good borrower or a bad borrower, what we have is an application score, right? So the application score is generated for every borrower who comes or every applicant who comes in for with credit application, right? So the applications are scored, and only the best applications are given the credit, right? So that in
Okay.
that way, what I'm trying to do is when I score people, I'm creating a kind of a rank, right? So if I'm scoring
Mm-hmm.
them, I'm creating kind of rank, and that is where I'm arranging them from the best to the worst, right? Or the worst to the best.
Okay.
And then I'm just
So
choosing
we
out the
can
best and giving the loan to them. Yeah, tell me.
okay. We can relate these reliability and affordabilities to the quantitative and the qualitative. I think the
Factors, right?
quantitative and qualitative factors, right?
Right,
Okay.
right. So, for
Got it.
example, demographic information, right? Demographic information like
Mm-hmm.
education level, your property ownership, your demographic location. So, these can give you a very clear idea about your reliability. On the other hand, your previous financial behaviors, your your monthly income, salary, whatever it is, your other fixed obligations, etc., will give the bank an idea about the affordability of the borrower for the product, right? So can a particular borrower actually afford a product? So this is where yes. And so this is how you manage risk at acquisition stage, right? Now once the person has been given the loan, the next part is to monitor his account and to assess his behavior, right? That is where you enter into the behavioral stage of the customer's credit cycle. So before I move on, is this part clear, Harpreet? Then I'll move on to the next.
Yes, it is clear to me.
Okay, great. So I'll just put you on mute, okay? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the next part is where we start talking about is the behavioral stage. So is the borrower, or how much is the borrower, or say, is a borrower willing to pay back the loan or not, right? And at this stage we try to judge his willingness, or judge the willingness of the borrower to pay back the credit. So what are the questions that a bank would actually ask at this stage? Let's see. So basically, when the borrower has been given the loan, the question that the bank is likely to ask over here is, number one, how willing is the borrower to pay back the loan? What is the willingness of the borrower to pay back the loan? How willing? Willing is the borrower to pay back the loan. Pay back credit. How willing is the borrower to pay back the. Now, if I'm talking about how willing is the borrower to pay back the credit, right? That means over here, if the borrower's willingness to pay back the credit is lower, higher will be his chances of defaulting on the loans, right? And if the willingness to pay back the credit for the bank for the person is very high, then lower will be his chances to default. So the question that the bank asks over here is, the bank is trying to assess that how likely is the borrower to default in the next 12 months. So basically, if I observe that the willingness of a borrower to pay back the credit is very low, then I know that there is a very low chance, or there is a very less chance of, you know, there is a very less chance of this borrower to default, right? So basically, if sorry, if I know that the willingness of the borrower to pay back the credit is very low, then I know that his chances to default is very high. On the other hand, if his willingness to pay back the loan is very high, I know that his chances to default is actually very low. So how does this happen? This is something that we need to understand. Okay. So over here, the next part that we talk about is, so what is the business problem that the bank will set over here? So for them, the problem changes to again a dichotomous problem, that y equal to 1 if the borrower defaults. If the borrower defaults in the next 12 months. Is equal to 0. Right. So basically, the idea over here is that if the willingness of a borrower to pay back the credit is very high, then the chances of the borrower to default will be very low. And if my willingness to pay back the credit is very low, then my chances to default will be very high, which is pretty intuitive, right? So basically, if I'm not willing to pay back the loan that I have taken, right, then I will obviously be a defaulter. Right now, I can be a willful defaulter, I can be a defaulter by circumstance, whatever it is, but I will be a defaulter. Right? So this is something that we have actually worked with, right? The next part is, so over here the probability is the probability y equals to 1. So again over here, the objective of the borrower is to estimate, is to identify the probability of the borrower to default in the next 12 months, right? So based on this, so this is a behavioral default model. So default models are mostly behavioral models. And in this part, And at this stage, so this is known as the behavioral stage or the account management stage, right? Okay. So yes, Harpreet, the model is the objective of the model of a model, or this kind of model, or as we call a behavior scorecard, is, or a behavioral model is, to predict the probability of a borrower to default in the next 12 months. So the point from where you are standing today, right? Within the next 12 months, how does the person behave like? So that is where it is. So then that is how it is, how it works. So say suppose I have developed a model and there is a model in place, right? Now standing today on the 25th of Feb, I want to know that what are the chances of the borrowers to default in the next 12 months. So from March to the Feb of next year, so I just run my model and I'll get the predicted values. Right. So this is how a model works. And then again, say I stand on March, and from March I try to predict that what are the within the next 12 months, what would be the probability of the borrower to default. Right. So these are what. So this is how models are developed. So at any point of time, generally looking to predict the probability of a borrower to default in the next 12 months, because the reason being that I always keep my provisions, I keep my costs, I make my allocations, cost allocations, I keep my funds accordingly. I didn't mention my funds on an annual basis. So before I do my fund allocation, I need to know that within the next 12 months, what are exactly the probability of defaults like, right? Okay. So this is the dependent variable. And over here at this behavior stage, at this behavior stage, what happens is, so this is the behavioral stage, the stage of behavioral modeling or the account management stage. These are the behavioral models, or this is also known as, for the business, the behavioral models are developed at the account management stage. Say for example, I want to give a credit limit increase to a credit card holder, right? Now before doing that, I need to understand that how good a borrower he is, how willing is he pay back, how willing is he to pay back my loan. So greater the willingness of the borrower to pay back the loan, the lower will be the probability of default. Right. So basically, based on his probability of default, I will assess whether I should give him a credit limit increase or not. Because say, suppose if I give him a credit limit increase and I see that his probability to default is actually very high, that means his willingness to pay back the loan is actually very low. Then I know that I am in for trouble, right? So that is the objective, or that is the reason why these behavioral models. So that is the reason why the behavioral models are first used to to pay back the credit, right? And from there, the next part that we do is we try to understand that how good or how bad a particular borrower is. So based on his chances of being a good or a bad borrower, we decide on how to we decide on how to do this. I mean, we decide on whether to give him a credit limit increase or not. So how to manage this particular account, right? So this is the reason why. So this is the reason why this stage is also known as the account management stage. Now, once this part has been done, right? Once I know what is chance of default, so I based on the chance of default, I can flag them as good or bad borrowers, right? Now, once I know that who are the bad borrowers, the next thing I know that many of these bad borrowers are going to default, which actually happens. And once that happens, they are placed into the collections process, right? Collections scorecard or collections do not come under risk management, because risk management is the ex ante management. Once the risk has happened, the ex post management goes into collections, and so then it is no more a risk. The danger has already happened, so the damage is already done. So collection scorecards are not a part of discussion in this particular module, right? So over here, the two types of scorecards that we talk about, or the type of business models that we talk about, is one is the origination scorecards, or the built at the acquisition stage to acquire customer on the books, and second is the behavioral models, or the behavior scorecards, which are developed in order to manage the account of the banks. Right. So this is something that what we are looking to actually do. Right. Okay. So this is what the overall framework is. So you observe that it is this existence of these private informations on part of the obligor, which creates all these, or from this what these risks generally stem from, right? Okay. So having said that, the next part that we talk about over here is, so we have discussed what exactly is the customer's credit cycle, right? So it starts from applying for a credit product and ends with either closing the account by paying off all the debts or being ultimately charged off. However, what you see is that each of these stages, right, we are trying to assess different characteristics of a borrower, and hence at each stage we are trying to manage the credit, the primary levels and the secondary levels of credit allocation across the behavior, across the borrowers, across the portfolio, right? So the next part that we need to understand is that, so before going to that, just a small note over here that this concept of credit risk that we have been talking about, right? So this credit risk, one thing we can clearly see, this originates from this credit risk. It originates from either a transaction risk or a borrower's risk. It originates from a transaction risk or a borrower's risk. transactions risk or borrower's risk. Right. So when we are developing credit risk models, all variables related to other kind of risks need to be removed, like so operational risk or market risk or others, they need to be removed. So basically, when we are talking about credit risk, we are talking about a very specific sort of risk which originates from transactions or the borrower's risk, right? So in regard to that, let us just highlight what are the key sets of risk to which a bank is exposed, right? So what are the risks to which the bank is exposed? Yes, I'll give you the example. So basically, talking about transaction risk. So transaction risk arises, right? So in case of say transaction risk happens that when you're doing a credit transaction, right? Then you know that there is a risk involved in that transaction that the borrower. So basically, when you are doing a transaction, right? So you have a due date of payment on every month and a date when to close that account, right? On the other hand, there is so that's the transaction that happens. So your transaction is that okay, this is to the I give you the loan today. Next month onwards, you're required to pay me an EMI. This will continue for 60 months and you stop. So over here, that is so
Uh, so, uh,
yeah.
just one question.
Mhm.
So that this transaction is with respect to the bank is doing that transaction or
So
the household persons, the
the
customers.
transaction happens between the obligor and the bank, right? So if I take a
Okay.
personal loan, the bank will tell me that okay, on 25th of Feb, you have taken a personal loan, and on the next 25th of Feb, you need to keep on paying this loan EMIs to me, right, for the next 60 months.
Okay.
So that's a transaction, right? Now, if I fail to
Mm-hmm.
honor it at any point of time, then that's a transaction risk, right?
Okay.
On the other hand, the transaction risk is arising because of a borrower's risk that the borrower lost his job suddenly and he is unable to pay the EMIs,
Okay. Got it.
right? Great.
If the borrowers is at risk, then the transactions will be at risk.
Correct. Correct. However, we generally use this transaction risk and borrower's risk concept in an intermittent term in credit risk, right? So the more prevalent term that we use is the borrower's risk. Now, what are the key sets of risk to which a bank is generally exposed to? A bank is generally exposed to three broad kind of risk. So basically, let's talk about banking risk first. Right. Now, within market risk, there are certain kind of others kind of risks as well, like liquidation risk. Then you have reputation risk, etc. So, which stems from any one of these three major risks, right? So you should always remember. Now the idea over here is to remember that when we are working with credit risk, right, any variables which are related to operational risk or market risk need to be removed. So basically it is the credit risk that is, and over here our objective will be focused it inherently on credit risk which arises from a credit transaction. So credit, market, operation. So market risk is the risk which arises from fluctuations in the market. Say for example, oil price fluctuations or macroeconomic factors, asset price crash, interest rate fluctuations, exchange rate shocks, or any supply or demand external supply or demand shocks. So use with this, there your market investments or your other market factors may be at risk, right? So your interbank lending may get threatened. So those factors they fall under operational risk. However, there is another kind of risk that we generally talk about called counterparty credit risk, right? It is generally now some people talk about it in terms of credit risk, but ideally it is generally under placed under a market risk, right? So there is this operational risk. So basically, credit market and operational risk. So over here, banking risk. So when I talk about banking risks over here, it's credit, market, and operational. So counterparty credit risk is under, or it's ideally placed under market risk, right? And operational risk contains risks like which arise from operational compromises, that data security gets the data gets compromised, private information is leaked, and so on. So these are some of the cases that is there, right? Fraud, bankruptcies, etc. Again, are a part of operational risk, right? So market crashes or loss of market values in investments, etc., are market factors. And on the other hand, the banking risk. So when I talk about credit risk, I'm talking about risk which solely stem from transactions, borrower's risk. Hence, these risk variables which reflect these risks, like market or operational, need to be adjusted accordingly. They need to be excluded while developing credit risk models. Clear? So basically, when by looking into the variables, right? So when we are actually working with the data, there are some n number of variables in the data. So we need to identify those variables which reflect market risk and operational risk, and those variables are to be removed. And from there, only the variables which reflect or which shows the transactional operational risk needs to be shown.
I
No,
mean, they're replaced by some
no, no, no,
constants
no, no. They
or
are totally
some
removed from the data. They are
factors.
totally removed from the data. Right. So I'll take
Okay,
up
they'll be
only
removed.
those variables which reflect either borrower's risk or some kind of transaction risk. So basically, borrower related behavior is something that I will keep, right?
Okay.
So all kind of
You use
Mhm.
the values. Sometimes the factors are not interdependent. Suppose credit risk sometimes might be dependent
Yes. So
on
obviously
market
there
or
are interdependencies, but they are
yes.
treated in isolation.
Okay.
For example, I'll give you an example. Say for example, in a data you are using a credit card data or a loan. So you use a credit card data. So basically, this person has a bank account with that particular bank. So suppose I have a credit card with Citibank, right? So I have a checkbook of Citibank and all this. Now what happens is that I have all my payment information, my balance information, everything, and along with that I have informations like branch where the account was opened, avails checkbook facilities or not, right? So now these are something which are not related to my credit risk. So whether I opened my account in Gurgaon branch or in Calcutta branch does not really matter, because they do not reflect any sort of riskiness or any factors of risk at my end, right? So this is how that is why these variables are actually removed from the analysis. Clear? Great. So the next part that we need to understand over here is that what are the key banking products? So how does a bank's portfolio look like? So what are the core divisions of a bank's given portfolio? And with that, we come to the portfolio divisions or the business products with which the bank operates. So a bank generally has two broad, or the banking portfolio can be divided into two broad divisions. the bank's portfolio, right? So the bank's portfolio comprises of two broad parts. One is the retail portfolio, and the other is a commercial portfolio. It's a retail portfolio and a commercial portfolio. So a retail portfolio is a portfolio which is where lending is done to the households, right? Households and small businesses. So retail portfolio or retail lending is done to households, and commercial lending is generally done for people, or it's generally done to people with businesses or who have huge businesses. So basically over here you have given to households, and commercial portfolio is for firms. And commercial portfolios is for firms, right? So when I talk about farms, by farms I mean farms which are SMEs and corporates. So over here I talk about SMEs, small medium scale enterprises, and corporates. Now obviously there are certain divisions that we need to understand, right? So what, how is it that it is defined as a corporate? How is it that it is defined as SME, etc. SMEs and corporates, right? So retails are households. So basically, retail loans are loans which are generally small in size. So one very typical characteristic of a retail loan would ideally be that there are small number, there are large number of accounts, and the exposure of each individual account is actually very small, right? So the overall exposure of the accounts are very small, but the common and but the number of accounts are very large. So basically, say there might be 3 million accounts, and the overall exposure of each account is around say 60 to 70 thousand dollars. On the other hand, commercial portfolios, the number of accounts, the number of obligors are actually very small, whereas the exposures of the accounts are very large, right? So say in some millions, or more than 10 or 10 million or more, right? So 1 to 10 million is the limit for SMEs, and more than 10 million is corporates. Right? So generally, the retail and commercial portfolios are generally defined, in terms of the number of accounts and the exposure per account. So basically, if I'm talking about a bank's portfolio, and these definitions are obtained from the Basel Accords, right? So over here, what we have is, so if you want to design any you want to define a retail or a commercial portfolio, these are defined in terms of the number of accounts, the number of accounts, and the exposure per account. Now, as per Basel records, or as per the Basel norms, right, the number of accounts for a retail portfolio is very large, and the exposure of each account is less than 1 million euro. So, if you have done a lending to an account which has, an exposure less than 1 million euro, you will consider it to be a retail portfolio. And hence, when lending is done for small businesses, right? Exposure at exposures, then this is to be taken into account, right? So then this exposure is something that needs to be taken into account. So the number of accounts and the number of exposures are something that we need to consider. Right. So basically, for commercial portfolios, the number of accounts, the number of obligors are relatively small, whereas the exposure per account is actually very large. Right. So this is how we define the two banks, the banks' two portfolios. Now, based on each of these portfolios, there are different kind of products which are available, and each of these products have their own sources of riskiness, right? So let's stop here today, and tomorrow's discussion, what we'll do is we'll start talking about the different credit products and how is it that they would actually work, right? So what are the sources of riskiness of these products and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay then.
So,
So,
yeah,
you can send me the link of this. You'll be sending me by today, right?
the recording,
Yes, the recording.
I'll be able to send to you tomorrow only, Harpreet, because Saturday and Sunday I'm stuck
Okay,
with sessions.
after.
Yeah, so my
Okay,
sessions
okay,
go
no
on till
problem.
11 in the night. So, today would not
Okay.
be possible. I'll complete the recording. I'll share it with you tomorrow, right? And
Okay.
I believe tomorrow
Mm-hmm.
we'll also have a class, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, tomorrow we'll be having it at 7 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right.
Okay. So, for only for tomorrow, can we have it in the evening?
At what time in the evening?
What would be a comfortable time for you?
It would be after 9:30 because I return from office around 9.
Okay, so 9:30 onwards, 9:30 to 11.
Okay. No problem. I can take that.
Okay,
9:30 to 11.
okay,
Uh,
sure. Thank you.
okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.